Hi, and welcome to this 3D Code Quick Start series. In this first lesson, we're going to focus on the user interface as well as viewport navigation. So let's get started by turning our attention to the splash screen, which appears each time you launch the application. The first thing you'll notice are the task-specific options, which will put you in the right workspace and have you set up properly for whatever task it is that you want to perform. And when you choose one of these options, you have different sub-options. For example, voxel sculpting. I can choose whether or not I want to start with one of these presets, or I could click on the folder icon in order to import a file from my hard drive. The first option is starting from the Sculpt workspace with a blank canvas. This may be the option to choose if you want to build your model from scratch using 3D Code's Primitives tool or other object construction tools. If you want to import a 3D scan mesh in order to use the sculpting tools to clean it up, you could choose this option. You could bring it in as a voxel object or in surface mode where you're working with just polygons. So let's go back. Now, if you want to import an image as a mesh, you can click on that. You can choose that here, and 3D Code will try to generate a 3D mesh from that image. Then you have these four task-centric options for texture painting. Vertex painting allows you to paint directly under the vertices of a high poly sculpt without the need for UVs. Then you have per pixel painting and micro vertex, which work on low polygon UV mapped models. The main difference is that per pixel painting mode works on normal maps in a depth channel, whereas micro vertex works on displacement in a depth channel. Paint with PTEX is very much like these two, except the UV process is handled by PTEX itself. This means you as a user can paint select an area of your mesh that you know you need more resolution in, and it will scale those polygons up in the UV space for you. The way 3D Code handles it is when you export outside the application, it'll generate a UV map that can be utilized by any rendering engine. So no special support for PTEX is needed. Then you have Perform Retopology. These first two will bring in a reference mesh, and it will have you set up inside the retopology workspace to begin retopologizing your model. But the first one is more of a legacy option. It's much more limited. The performance isn't nearly as good as importing your model into the Sculpt workspace, which this option provides you. And you have all the same options you would for sculpting and posing your model. You can apply PBR shaders. There's just so many things you can do with it that you can't do with this first option. And then it's going to place you in the Retopo workspace to begin creating your retopology mesh. So yeah, I would definitely stick with the second option if you're coming from another sculpting application. This next option is importing a low polygon mesh that you may want to perform some slight edits or maybe to do some additional poly modeling. This fourth option is for when you want to auto retopologize a high poly sculpt. It's very similar to this one, except it will initialize the auto retopo process. So let's go back. Then just below that you have a specialty option for prototyping, CNC, removing undercuts, and so on. And then this UV map mesh, if you want to import a low polygon model for laying out the UVs in 3D Code. The lone remaining option is opening the last file you happen to be working on. Let's now turn our attention to the upper left-hand corner of the user interface and explore the Workspace tabs. These are much like working in Lightwave or Modo, where you have different layouts depending on the task. So for example, in the Paint workspace, if you import a model here, you'll have a paint mesh, and in the Retopo workspace, if you create something from scratch or you import a low polygon mesh into this workspace, it will be classified as a Retopo mesh. And likewise in the Sculpt workspace, in the Vox Tree layer panel, if you import a model or build something from scratch here, all your objects will be listed in the Vox Tree layer panel. So you have three separate and distinct mesh types, and once more, they are separated into their own unique workspaces. Now the Retopo workspace has included a number of preset models that you can start from, as well as new primitives tool. If you want, you can use it as a basic poly modeling toolset inside of 3D Code so that you don't have to step outside of the application to perform many of your poly modeling tasks. When you import a model into the Paint workspace, you have two companion workspaces that will work on paint objects, and that is the tweak room and the UV room. So let me go ahead from the splash screen and bring in this sphere. You can go to the view menu and turn wireframe on. You'll now see this object listed in the paint object section. If I had multiple UVs, you would see that reflected in surface materials. I cannot manipulate this object inside of this workspace. It is strictly for painting. But if I need to make some modest transforms, I can use options here, or some of the basic sculpting tools that are just for tweaking. It's really not an advanced sculpting environment. So if you want to do that, you would want to move to the Sculpt workspace. And then in the UV workspace, this works on just paint objects. Objects that, again, have been imported into this workspace. So once more, the tweak room and the UV room are companions of the paint workspace. Oftentimes, when a new user is working in the Retopo workspace, after they've created the Retopo mesh, they will step into the UV workspace and not see their model. Let me go ahead and hide that for the moment. They won't see their model, and that is because the Retopo workspace has its own set of UVs here. This is a mirrored set of UV tools. It allows you to go ahead and take care of your UVs right here in the very same workspace. When you click on a button here in the UV subsection of the tool panel, you'll notice a number of different UV related tools will open up to you. And then you have a UV preview window here. And just to the upper left hand corner, you can cycle between different UV sets. You can also select different shells or islands in your UV and then move them to different UV sets here. Okay, so let's unhide our paint object. Let me further emphasize the point that these mesh structures are unique. You cannot work on them in other rooms outside of the two that I just mentioned. For example, if I have this paint object, I cannot work on it, even though I can see it in the Retopo workspace. It's not designed for me to actually manipulate this individual mesh. And likewise in the Sculpt workspace. So if you import a model into the Paint workspace, you will not see it here. However, we do have one exception to that rule regarding Sculpt objects. Any meshes residing in the Sculpt room can be painted in the Paint workspace, and that's because 3D Coat shares the paint tools from the Paint workspace with both paint objects and Sculpt objects, even though they reside in separate rooms. So if I were to paint on this at this point in time, let me turn my metalness all the way up. 3D Coat uses vertex paint for Sculpt objects, and that means there are no UVs involved whatsoever. Paint objects, on the other hand, tend to be low to medium poly meshes, and they require UV maps to paint on. The UV Texture Editor provides a 2D texture painting environment for UV mapped paint objects, and it works much like having Photoshop docked inside your UI. The main benefit of vertex painting is you don't have any UVs to be concerned with, but then you cannot use a 2D texture editor. I'll hide that. Go back to my paint object, unhide that. As I work on the paint object in a 3D viewport, you will see the update occur in the 2D texture editor immediately once I finish the stroke. As I'm painting in the 2D workspace, you can see how it's immediately updating as I brush in the 3D viewport. Speaking of panels, that leads me to the next topic. Just as you would in Photoshop, you can pull panels away and dock them wherever you like. You'll see a little highlight that will indicate you're ready to drop this panel, and it will dock it. If you want, you can leave them floating. If you have a hotkey assigned to it, for example, this one I assigned the T key. You can always assign hotkeys by hitting the End key on your keyboard. I assigned a T key here, and this will allow me to close this panel, and at any point in time when I'm ready for it, I can bring it right back up. Now this panel is a little bit unique in that it won't come back up where you have your cursor like most other panels will. Instead, it'll reappear in the same location you had it last. Alright, so let me go ahead and dock that again.